The tomato plant died because you loved it too much. Not from neglect. From water, from attention, from checking it twice a day, and adding a little more of everything every time it looked unhappy. By the time we reach the end, you will know the 10 things a garden teaches after 50, why they arrive in a fixed order, and why the 10th one cannot reach you until you have stopped expecting anything. You were 54 years old, standing over a pot on a back step at 7 in the morning, holding a watering can, and something in you understood before your mind did that the problem was not the plant. There was a neighbor on that street who had been growing things for 40 years. Every March they went out to a rose that looked, to any honest eye, absolutely fine. Healthy canes, good color, buds already swelling, and they cut it back hard down to almost nothing, 3 or 4 stubs of wood standing in bare soil, and then they went inside and made coffee as though nothing had happened. The first spring you saw it, you thought it was a mistake. The second spring you assumed it was some regional technique. The third spring you asked. They said, you will know by about the 9th year. That was the entire answer. They went back inside. Hold on to that, because we are coming back to it, and the answer turns out to be about something much larger than a rose. Here is what nobody sits you down and explains. A garden is not a set of tasks. It is a slow argument with the way you have been taught to move through the world, and it wins that argument one small humiliation at a time. It does not lecture. It does not correct you in the moment. It simply produces a result some weeks later that could not have come from anywhere else and leaves you to work backward to the cause. That is why the lessons take so long to land. There is a delay built into every single one of them. Think about the last time you learned something quickly. Someone told you, or you read it, or you watched it happen, and you understood it inside an afternoon. Now think about how much of that you still carry. Almost none of it. The things you actually know, the ones that changed how you behave rather than just what you can say, arrived slowly and mostly against your will. A garden is a machine for producing that second kind of knowledge. It is inefficient. It is uncomfortable. It is the only reliable one most people ever have access to after 50. And there is a strange thing about the timing. Most people find their way to this in the second half of their life, not the first. Not because younger people cannot garden, obviously they can, but because the specific lessons a garden offers are almost impossible to hear until you have already lost something, already been wrong about something important, already had the experience of doing everything correctly and getting nothing for it. Before 50, a plant that fails is a problem to solve. After 50, it is a mirror, and you did not ask for a mirror. So here are 10 of them. Not tips, not techniques. The things that get taught quietly over years to anyone who keeps showing up, and that almost nobody names out loud because naming them makes them sound smaller than they are. The first one is the one that killed the tomato, and it is the one almost everybody resists the longest. Picture the seed packet. On the back in small print, it says germination 7 to 14 days. You write the date on a strip of masking tape and stick it to the tray. Day 7 arrives, nothing. Day 9, still nothing. You lift the tray to the window, which does nothing except move the tray. You press a finger into the soil to check the moisture, which mostly checks whether you can tolerate not checking. On day 11, you scrape a small amount of soil away from where you think a seed is, just to look, which is the gardening equivalent of opening the oven every 4 minutes. On day 13, there is a green hook breaking the surface, and it was always going to be day 13, and every single thing you did between day 7 and day 13 was for you. That is the first lesson, and it is the one that arrives fastest and gets accepted slowest. Nothing here runs on your schedule. Not your convenience, not your available weekend, not your patience, not your need to see progress today because today was hard. You will spend the first several years quietly negotiating with this. You will buy larger plants so you can skip the waiting. You will use fertilizer to accelerate things that do not accelerate. You will plant in April because you are ready in April, and the soil is not ready in April, and the soil is not interested in whether you are. The tomato died because you were trying to hurry a thing whose entire nature is that it cannot be hurried, and the only tool you had for hurrying was more. More water, more feed, more attention. The plant experienced all of that as drowning. Here is a number worth sitting with. An oak takes roughly 20 to 30 years to produce its first meaningful crop of acorns. Not to look like a tree, it looks like a tree fairly early. To do the actual thing it exists to do. 20 to 30 years, and there is no version of caring more that changes it. Now think about how you have organized almost every other part of your life. Around response time. Around the ability to apply effort and see something move. You learned somewhere in your 20s or 30s that pressure produces results, and mostly it did, and you built a whole self around that being true. The garden does not accept pressure as a currency. It has no mechanism for receiving it. You can stand over a bed in July at 11 at night wanting something to be further along than it is, and the entire universe of effect that your wanting produces is zero. For some people, that is enraging. For most people, eventually, it is the single most restful discovery of their adult life. Because if effort cannot speed it up, then the frantic version of you is not required here. You can do the actual work, which is small and specific and finishes in an hour, and then you are done, and the rest is not yours. There is a version of you that has been waiting a very long time for something to say that. But accepting that you cannot speed it up leads directly into the second thing. And the second thing is harder, because it asks you to look at something you have been successfully avoiding for years. The leaves were yellowing from the bottom up. You had noticed it for about 10 days in the way you notice things you do not want to deal with, which is to say you registered it from 6 feet away while walking past on your way somewhere else. Then one morning, you actually knelt down. Kneeling changes everything, and not for the reason people say. It is not about humility or reverence or any of that. It is that from 6 feet away, a plant is a single object with a single condition, healthy or not healthy. From 8 inches away, it is 100 separate pieces of information. The undersides of the lower leaves, the color of the stem where it meets the soil, whether the soil is crusted or open, whether there is something small and pale clustered in the joint where a leaf meets the stem. You knelt down and there they were, hundreds of them on the undersides where you had never once looked. The second thing a garden teaches is that almost every problem you have was visible earlier, smaller and easier, and you did not look, and the not looking was a choice you did not experience as a choice. This is where people get uncomfortable, so let us be precise about it. The failure was not that you missed it. Nobody sees everything. The failure was that some part of you knew there was something worth kneeling for, and it was easier to keep walking, and so you kept walking for 10 days while a small problem became a real one. You know exactly where else in your life you do this. That is the uncomfortable part, and it is why this lesson lands hardest after 50 rather than before. By 50, you have accumulated a certain amount of evidence about yourself. You have a relationship you have been not looking at closely, a number you have not wanted to add up, a symptom you have been describing to yourself as probably nothing for considerably longer than probably nothing takes. The garden does not know about any of that. It simply demonstrates the principle in miniature on a schedule, in a context where the stakes are one plant and the cost of learning is survivable. And then it does something more useful. It shows you the other half, which is that close looking is not the same as worrying. Worrying is standing at the window at 6 feet, feeling bad about the yellow leaves, generating no information. Close looking is kneeling, turning a leaf over, finding out. Worrying can go on for years. Close looking takes about 90 seconds and it either produces something you can act on or it produces relief. Almost everyone has the ratio backward. Hours of the first, none of the second. There is a particular kind of person who resists this, and it is worth naming because you might be one. The person who says they are not a details person, who says they see the big picture, who has organized an entire identity around not kneeling down. The garden is patient with that person for about 2 seasons. Then it stops being patient because the aphids do not care about the big picture, and by year 3 the roses are covered. There is a small habit that experienced gardeners have and rarely mention because it sounds like nothing. They walk the same route every morning. Same order, same beds, same corners most days for years. It looks like routine, and it is not routine. It is a comparison instrument. When you see the same 8 square feet of ground 300 times a year, your eye stops reading it as a scene and starts reading it as a change. You do not consciously notice that a leaf is a slightly duller green than it was on Tuesday. Something below conscious noticing flags it, and you find yourself kneeling before you have decided to kneel. That capacity cannot be installed by effort. It is built entirely by repetition on one small piece of ground, which is why someone who has tended a modest garden for 15 years will spot a problem in 4 seconds that a far more knowledgeable person, walking through for the first time, will miss completely. Knowledge is not the instrument, familiarity is. And familiarity has a cost that nobody mentions, which is that you have to stay in one place, looking at the same unremarkable things, long past the point where they are interesting. Most people will not do that. It is the single largest reason gardens fail, and it has nothing to do with skill. So you learn to kneel. And once you are down there, 8 inches from the soil with your hands in it, you notice the thing that leads to the third lesson. And the third lesson is the one that quietly rearranges how you think about every kind of work you have ever done. You pulled a plant that had done nothing all summer, 6 inches tall in June, 6 inches tall in August. You had written it off in July and left it there out of some vague sense that pulling it would be admitting something. When it finally came out, the roots kept coming and coming. A root mass 3 times the size of everything visible above the soil, pale and dense and complicated, spread out through a volume of earth you would never have guessed. It had not been doing nothing. It had been doing almost everything, in the only place you were not able to look. This is the third thing, and it arrives as a genuine physical shock the first time, because you have been evaluating that plant all summer using a measurement that was capturing maybe a fifth of what was happening. Now apply that honestly. How much of your working life was spent being measured on the visible part? How much of your own judgment of other people runs on the same instrument? You look at someone's summer and you see 6 inches, and you conclude 6 inches. There is a plant that makes this almost comic, asparagus. You plant the crowns, and for 2 full years you are instructed to harvest nothing at all. Not a little. Nothing. 2 years of tending something that gives you back precisely 0, while underground it builds the root system that will then produce for 15 or 20 years. Cut in year 1 and you get a small handful of spears and a plant that never fully recovers. 2 years of visible nothing, buying 20 years of something. There is no spreadsheet in the world that would approve that trade at the point where you have to make it. And yet everyone who has grown asparagus will tell you the same thing, which is that year 3 is the year the ground opens, and it does not stop. Here is why this matters more after 50 than it did before. Before 50, most of what you were building was legible. Career, house, children, the visible markers, the things you could point at. After 50, a great deal of the important work stops producing visible output. Repairing something with someone. Coming to terms with a version of your life that did not happen. Rebuilding health slowly. Becoming a person your grandchildren will actually want to sit next to. None of that shows up above the soil for a long time. And if the only measurement you have is the visible one, you will conclude, incorrectly and painfully, that you are doing nothing with these years. The garden gives you a second instrument, not faith exactly, something more grounded than faith. It gives you the repeated, physical, undeniable experience of pulling something up and finding out you were wrong about what was happening underneath. Do that enough times and you stop trusting the surface reading, not because you have decided to be optimistic, but because you have direct evidence that the surface reading is unreliable. That is a genuinely different way to live, and almost nobody arrives at it through argument. Which brings up the obvious objection. If you cannot see what is happening, how do you ever know when something has truly failed? How do you tell the plant that is building roots from the plant that is simply dying? That question is the fourth lesson, and the answer costs something. 4 hydrangeas went into that bed in the spring. Same day, same compost, same water, same everything. By August, 3 of them were doing what hydrangeas do, and one was a collection of brown sticks. You did what everyone does. You did more for the failing one. You watered it separately. You fed it. You moved a chair so it got a different light for part of the afternoon. You read 3 contradictory things online at 11 at night. You gave that single plant more of your attention across one summer than the other 3 combined, and it died anyway in October, having consumed most of the season's worry. The fourth thing a garden teaches, and it teaches this one roughly once a year until it takes, is that a loss is information, and not every loss is yours to prevent. Something in that spot was wrong. Drainage, most likely. A stone shelf under the soil. A pocket of builder's rubble from decades ago. A root from a tree 2 gardens over. You could not see it, you did not cause it, and no amount of care applied to the leaves was ever going to address a problem that lived 18 inches down. Here is the part that stings. The other 3 thrived under ordinary attention. The failing one absorbed everything and returned nothing. And the whole time, the actual lesson was sitting there being ignored, which was not save this plant but find out what is wrong with this spot. You know people who have organized decades around the failing hydrangea. This is not an argument for giving up quickly. Gardens punish that too, and there is a whole separate category of plants that look finished in July and come back in September if left alone. The lesson is subtler and harder. It is that your care is finite, that it is a real resource with a real total, and that spending it on the thing that cannot use it is not generosity. It is just spending. There is an old practice worth knowing about here. Experienced gardeners keep what some of them call a failure list. Not a list of plants that died, which would be depressing and useless. A list of what was in that spot when it died, what the weather had done, what was nearby. Kept over several years, that list stops being a record of failure and becomes a map. This corner floods. Nothing survives under the ash. The bed by the south wall cooks anything with shallow roots by mid-July. None of that could be learned any other way. Every line on that map was paid for with something that died. Which reframes the entire thing. The plant did not fail, the plant reported. And once you have that framing, something loosens in you that has probably been tight for a very long time. Because most people carry a private list of the things they could not save, and they carry it as evidence of insufficiency. The garden makes a quiet case that some of those entries were never save or fail decisions. Some of them were reports about conditions 18 inches down that nobody could see. That is a difficult idea to accept about a plant. It is a much harder one to accept about a person or about a stretch of years. The garden does not push. It just runs the demonstration again next spring, and the spring after that, until one year you notice you did not spend August fighting for the hydrangea, and you feel something that is not quite guilt and not quite relief. And around that time, usually, you become aware of the thing that has been true the whole while, and that you have somehow never quite looked at directly. It is the second week of August and you are planting. Not tending, not harvesting, planting. Small seed going into warm soil for something that will not be ready to eat until the weather has turned cold enough that you will want soup. And it strikes you, with your hands in the dirt and the summer still loud around you, that you are working for a version of yourself who is currently 4 months away and slightly colder, and probably tired in a different way than you are tired now. The fifth thing is that you are never actually working in the season you are standing in. Not once, not ever. Spring work is for summer. Summer work is for autumn. Autumn work, the bulbs, the mulch, the bare root planting that feels pointless in November, is for a spring so far away that you cannot picture the weather. Even the winter work, the pruning of a dormant thing in the cold, is for a season 2 turns ahead. Every single hour is deposited somewhere you are not. Now hold that next to how the rest of modern life is built, which is around the immediate return. The result today, the response now, the measurable outcome inside the reporting period. Most people spend 40 years inside systems designed to make effort and reward as close together as possible, and then wonder why they feel unable to do anything that does not pay out quickly. The garden runs the opposite operating system, and it runs it without apology, and it will not negotiate. Here is the strange consequence, and this is the part that surprises people. Working entirely for a future you are not in should feel like deferral. It should feel like sacrifice, like putting your life off. It does not. It feels like the opposite. Ask anyone who plants garlic in October. It goes in the ground when everything else is finishing. It sits through the entire winter doing nothing you can observe. It comes up in spring and is not ready until the following July. 9 months, roughly, from a clove pushed into cold soil to something you can actually cook with. Nobody who plants garlic describes those 9 months as waiting. They describe October as garlic planting, which is a thing they enjoy, and July as garlic harvest, which is a thing they enjoy, and the winter in between as winter. That is the trick, and it is not a trick at all. The pleasure is not stored in the payoff. It is distributed across the whole length of the thing, which means the entire framing of delayed gratification, the phrase everyone uses, is describing something that does not actually happen here. Nothing is delayed. The gratification is in the October morning, cold hands, good soil, a task with a clear end. The July harvest is separate and additional. If you have spent your life waiting for things to pay off before you were allowed to enjoy them, this is a genuinely disorienting discovery, and it usually takes a few seasons to trust. And once you do trust it, you start doing something that would have looked to your younger self like madness. You start planting things whose timeline is longer than your interest in the outcome, which is when the garden shows you what it thinks of your ambition. In the form of a single bed, you filled too enthusiastically in April. The spacing instruction said 18 inches apart. You looked at the seedlings, which were 4 inches tall and pathetic, and you looked at the bed, which was enormous and empty and embarrassing, and you did the reasonable thing, which was to put them 9 inches apart, because 18 inches of bare soil between two tiny plants is an unbearable sight in May. In May it looked generous. In June it looked full. In July it looked magnificent for about 10 days. By the first week of August, the whole bed had gone soft and gray at the base. Nothing was drying out between waterings. Mildew moved through it in 4 days because the air could not get in. Every plant was competing with two others for the same water and the same light, and the result was not a bumper crop divided among many. It was many plants each producing badly. You would have harvested more from half as many. That is not a moral point. It is an arithmetic one, and it is reproducible, and every experienced gardener has done the experiment by accident. The sixth thing is that crowding is not abundance. They look identical in May. Sit with how much of adult life this describes. The calendar with no white space in it, which feels like a full life right up until the week something goes wrong, and there is no give anywhere. The house that accumulated things at a rate no one ever decided on. The commitments taken because each one individually seemed small, until the base of the whole arrangement went soft and gray, and nothing was drying out between waterings. The mistake in the seed bed and the mistake in the calendar have the same root, which is the inability to tolerate visible emptiness. 18 inches of bare soil is not waste. It is the air the plant will need in August, purchased in May, when purchasing it feels like giving something up. There is a specific practice that makes this concrete, and almost every beginner finds it genuinely painful. Thinning. You sow a row, everything germinates, and you have a dense green line of healthy seedlings. And the instruction is to pull out most of them. Not the weak ones, not the damaged ones. Perfectly good, thriving young plants, removed and discarded so that the remaining ones have room. People cannot do it. They thin half as much as they should and tell themselves it will be fine. It is never fine. And what makes it hard is not the plants. It is that thinning requires you to act on a projection. The crowding is not a problem yet. It will be a problem in 7 weeks. To thin correctly, you have to be able to feel a future consequence strongly enough to inconvenience yourself now, in a situation where everything currently looks wonderful. That capacity is rare, and it can be trained. The garden trains it cheaply once a year, with stakes low enough that failure only costs you a poor harvest. Which means the person who has been gardening for a decade has run that particular exercise 10 times, and it starts showing up elsewhere, in what they agree to and what they decline, usually without them connecting the two things at all. But there is a harder version of this coming, because eventually the garden asks you to remove something you did not plant by mistake. something you chose deliberately, defended for years, and were completely certain about. There was a shrub against the fence that you were sure about. You chose it. You researched it. You defended it the first year when it looked rough, and the second year when someone politely suggested it might not be happy there. And by the third year defending it had become a small matter of pride, because you had said out loud that it would come good. It did not come good. It was never going to come good. It was a plant for a different amount of light, and you had known that in some barely admitted way since about the 2nd August. The year you finally took it out, the whole corner changed inside a single season. The seventh thing is that you will outlive your own certainties, and the garden is where you get to find that out on something that is not a person. This is the lesson that separates people who have gardened for 3 years from people who have gardened for 15. The 3-year gardener is still accumulating opinions. The 15-year gardener has started discarding them and can tell you specifically which ones, and is not embarrassed about it. Ask someone who has grown things for decades what they were wrong about. A real one will not hesitate. They will tell you they were wrong about a particular plant, wrong about how much sun that side of the house actually gets, wrong for years about how deep to plant something because of a book they trusted. They will tell you the year they stopped doing a thing they had been doing religiously since the beginning, and the fact that nothing got worse. There is no defensiveness in it. That is the striking part. In almost every other domain, being wrong for a decade is an injury to be managed. Here it is just information that arrived late. The reason is worth understanding because it explains something about why this particular practice does what it does to people. In an argument, being wrong costs you standing. Someone else is right. There is a winner. In a garden, being wrong costs you a shrub, and the shrub is not keeping score, and there is nobody in the corner by the fence who gets to feel vindicated. Consequence without judgment. That combination is almost impossible to find anywhere else in adult life, and it turns out to be exactly the environment a person needs in order to change their mind. Now that neighbor and the rose. Cutting a rose back hard in early spring feels like destruction because you are removing healthy wood. What it actually does is force the plant to put its energy into a small number of strong new canes instead of maintaining a large amount of tired old growth. Left uncut, a rose gets bigger and steadily worse. The flowers get smaller. The center gets congested. It looks fuller every year and performs less every year. The reason it takes about 9 years to understand is that for the first several you're comparing your cut rose against your neighbor's uncut one in June, and yours looks smaller, and you feel like a vandal. It is only after enough seasons that you have watched a rose that was never cut become a large woody tangle producing almost nothing, while the one that gets taken to 3 stubs every March comes back stronger than the year before. You cannot be told this. Not really. You can be told the words and you will nod, and you will still flinch the first time you put the loppers to something that looks perfectly healthy. That flinch is worth paying attention to, because it is the same flinch that shows up in front of every genuinely useful removal you will ever have to make. And the strangest part of all of this is that, while you have been busy learning it, something has been happening to you that you did not agree to and did not notice. You went out at 6:40 in the morning because a thing needed doing that would take 11 minutes. You came back in 45 minutes later and you could not fully account for the difference. Nothing dramatic happened. You did the 11-minute task. Then you stood for a while at the end of the bed. Then you noticed the beans had found the string, and you went and looked at that, and then you pulled a few things that were not supposed to be there, and then you just stood some more. You did not decide to stay. You did not experience it as relaxing while it was happening. You only noticed afterward indoors that your shoulders were somewhere different than they had been at 6:30. The eighth thing is the one that gets talked about the least and is probably the largest. Whatever you tend starts tending you, and it does it without announcing itself, and it does it whether or not you believe in it. Part of it is ordinary and physical. You are outside. You are in early light, which does more to your sleep that night than most people realize. You are moving in ways that no exercise class contains, which is to say squatting, reaching, kneeling, standing up again, carrying uneven weight across uneven ground. Your hands are in soil. Your attention is on something at a distance of 2 feet rather than 18 inches from a lit screen. But the mechanism that matters most is subtler. For those 45 minutes, you were needed by something that did not want anything from you. Think about how rare that is. Nearly everything that needs you also wants something. It wants a decision, a reply, a share of your attention that comes with an expectation attached. A row of beans needs water and it needs the string tied and it has no opinion about you whatsoever. It will not be disappointed. It is not keeping a record. That specific combination, being necessary and being unobserved, is something people spend a great deal of money trying to buy in other forms. And this is precisely why the second half of life is when it lands. Because there is a transition in most lives, somewhere in the 50s or 60s, from being needed constantly and often exhaustingly to being needed less, and it happens faster than anyone prepares you for. Children establish their own lives. Work stops calling. The phone gets quieter in a way that nobody warns you about because it would sound ungrateful to complain about. A garden does not replace any of that. It would be sentimental to claim it does. But it does restore one specific ingredient that goes missing, which is having something outside yourself that genuinely requires you on a schedule you do not fully control. It is real work. Skip a week in July and the consequences are visible. That reality is the whole point. You cannot get the same effect from a thing you could abandon without consequence. So you go out for 11 minutes and you come back in 45, several times a week, for years, and something in your nervous system reorganizes itself around the fact that there is a place where the demands are honest and finite and completed by lunchtime. Nobody sits you down and tells you this is happening. You find out later, usually during a difficult stretch, when you notice that the first place you go is out the back door. And there is a detail here that is easy to dismiss and probably should not be. It is the hands. Almost every form of rest available now involves the hands doing nothing, or doing one small repetitive thing on a piece of glass. Gardening is one of the few remaining activities where the hands are fully occupied with something that has texture and weight and resistance, and that pushes back in a physical way. Soil is cold in the morning and warm by afternoon. Roots tear with a specific sound. A stem that is ready to come away does so cleanly, and one that is not does not, and you learn the difference through your fingers rather than your eyes. People who work with their hands regularly describe a quality of thinking that happens only then. Not focused thinking. The other kind, where a problem you have been grinding at for 2 weeks resolves itself while you are doing something entirely unrelated and mildly physical. That is not mysticism. It is simply that some part of the mind requires the rest of you to be occupied before it will offer anything up. Which means the 45 minutes was not time away from thinking. For a lot of people, it is the only stretch in the day when the useful kind actually happens. And once you have been out that back door enough times, across enough years, you start doing the last thing on this list. The one that only becomes possible once you have stopped expecting to see the end of anything. There was an empty corner for 6 years. Not neglected, empty. You mowed around it. You had opinions about what should go there and you never acted on any of them. And if anyone asked, you said you had not decided yet, which was true and was not the whole truth. Then one autumn, at an age where you had a fairly clear sense of the arithmetic, you planted a tree there. A slow one. A species that would be pleasant in 15 years and genuinely good in 40. You did the sum standing there with the spade. Everyone does. You cannot avoid doing it. And you planted it anyway. And something about that afternoon was different from every other planting you had ever done. The 9th and 10th things arrive together. And they are the reason people who garden late in life describe it in a register that makes everyone else slightly uncomfortable. The 9th is that at some point you stop planting for the harvest and start planting for the continuation. Nobody announces this transition. You notice it in retrospect. The year you put in something you will not see mature and it did not feel like a loss. The 10th is that a garden is one of the only things you can build that keeps running after you stop. Not a monument. Monuments just sit there and slowly degrade. A garden actually continues, and it continues doing the specific thing it was designed to do, and it improves in some respects entirely without you. The tree gets larger. The soil you fed for 20 years is still better soil. The bulbs come up. Something you put in the ground in your 60s is at its best long after nobody in the house remembers who put it there. There is a phrase that gets quoted so often it has gone soft, about societies growing great when people plant trees whose shade they will never sit in. It is quoted at graduations. It has lost all its edges. Go stand in a garden with a spade and a young tree and an accurate sense of your own arithmetic, and it stops being a quotation. It becomes an unusually specific physical act. 40 pounds of root ball, a hole, a decision made with full information. And here is what the people who have done it report consistently, and what almost nobody expects. It is not sad. It is the least sad thing available. Because the alternative framing, the one most people carry, is that everything you do only counts if you are present to see it count. That is an exhausting way to hold a life, and it gets more exhausting every year past 60, and it quietly rules out most of what is actually worth doing in the last third. The garden offers a different arrangement without ever stating it. It says the work is real whether or not you are there for the result. You already know that is true because you have been living it since the first time you planted garlic in October. You just applied it to 9 months. This applies it to 40 years. The principle did not change, only the scale. That is the whole education, and it takes about a decade, and there is no shortcut. Which brings us back to a pot on a back step, and a watering can, and a person who thought the problem was the plant. The tomato died because you loved it too much, and it took another 15 years to fully understand what that sentence was actually about. It was not about tomatoes. It was about a way of caring that had never been examined, in which the measure of love was quantity, and attention was something you applied rather than something you gave, and the appropriate response to any anxiety about a thing was to do more to it. That approach had worked well enough in other places, or at least had not obviously failed. Applied to a plant in a pot, it produced a clear and rapid result, and the result was death, and the timeline was short enough that the connection could not be avoided. That is the strangest gift in all of this. A garden compresses the consequences of how you actually are into a season, and then hands them to you without comment, and does it again next year. 10 things, nothing answers on your schedule. You cannot fix what you will not look at closely. Most of the work is where you cannot see it. A loss is information. Not everything is yours to save. You are never working in the season you are standing in. Crowding is not abundance. You will outlive your own certainties. Whatever you tend starts tending you, and you are planting for someone you will never meet. Not one of those is about gardening. Every one of them was learned by gardening, which is a different claim entirely, and it is the claim that matters. There is a reason none of this can be delivered as advice. Read the list, and it is a set of reasonable sentiments, the kind of thing that goes on a card. Live it, through a killed tomato and a wasted summer on a hydrangea and a shrub you defended for 3 years out of pride, and a rose you were too frightened to cut for the better part of a decade, and it becomes structural. It changes what you do at 7 in the morning. That neighbor was right, incidentally, and the answer did take about 9 years. Not 9 years to understand the pruning. 2 seasons would do that. 9 years to stop flinching. 9 years for the knowledge to move from the part of you that agrees with things into the part of you that acts. They knew that when they said it, standing there in March with the loppers, declining to explain. They were not being mysterious. They were being accurate about how long it takes, and they knew that any explanation given that morning would only produce a person who could repeat it. So they went inside and made coffee, and left the ground to do the teaching. It always does. It is slower than anything else you will ever learn from, and it does not care whether you are ready, and it is the only teacher that has never once been wrong. Everything worth knowing after